Well, actually, the Egyptians developed it into a far more sophisticated instrument than the Celtic cross, which is accurate. The one I've made is as a copy of the Dixon relics, still partly in the pyramid and partly in the British Museum. It's accurate to 3 arc minutes.
Can you explain these Dixon relics to the people who don't know anything?
Yeah, Dixon relics were found in 1872 by a gentleman called Wayman Dixon. And a helper he had called Bill Grundy, and they were inside the Great Pyramid and noticed a tiny gap in the wall in the Queen's Chamber, and Bill Grundy was asked if he would breach the gap, knock it out, in other words. So he took a hammer and a chisel, won't be able to do that today, and knocked this gap out, and what they found was shafts. And what they thought they were was air shafts, but when they breached the north shaft of the Queen's Chamber, some items fell out. And the items were a 1 pound 3 ounce ball of bluish grey granite, and a little bronze hook in the shape of the Aries sign, or the sign of Amun, Amen. Okay, certainly it's the Greek sign for Aries. And also what looked like was recorded to be part of a cubit roll.
You say recorded to be?
It was recorded to be that by Piazzi Smythe, who was the Astronomer Royal for Scotland. Because what happened was Wayman Dixon boxed these up into a cigar box and sent them back to Edinburgh, where they became obscurely lost and so forth. But it was recorded by Piazzi Smythe, the Astronomer Royal. He measured them, weighed them, and
so what do you believe happened to this rod?
The rod's still in the pyramid.
It's
still in the pyramid, or it was the last time we saw it, because a guy called Rudolf Gantenbrink put up a tiny robot under the direction of Zahi Hawass, director of Egyptian antiquities. But what happened was that Gantenbrink, in sending his robot up the shaft, sent one up the north shaft of the Queen's Chamber, and at the top of the shaft can still be seen, under a rod that was reputedly sent up by Wayman Dixon at the time, and it's jammed up there. Underneath it, a very thin lat of wood with a fractured end, and then another piece with holes in it, which show that the little Aries hook fitted those.
Right.
So what we can tell from that, because that artefact was still there in 1993 and filmed to be so for posterity, was that part of the rod was still up the shaft at that time.
The discovery of the Dixon relics and what they are. So, how did this relate to the Celtic cross?
Well, what really happened, if you take you back to the beginning, when I discovered the Celtic cross originally, what had happened was in 1997. I had heard through various authors and academics that the Great Pyramid of Giza was aligned to the North Pole Star. That troubled me, of course, because there was no pole star at the time. But having said that it was aligned. And also I looked at it because I've got a background in design and architecture, and so has my family, and I thought, well, the instruments that they have are not adequate for the job. This is one of the most sophisticated buildings in the world. In the whole of our world now, there is not a building, even of smaller size, that is so well aligned. It's only a few centimetres out, and quite remarkable, apart from the tonnage and weight and so forth. This is not adequate. There were 2 instruments that we know about. One was called the Bay and the other one was called the Merchet. And these 2 instruments were plumb lines. One was really based on a palm leaf, and the other one is based on sort of if you like, an upright stick with a crossed member sticking out of one side and then the plumb line hanging down it to get alignments. But neither of those instruments would do what's vitally important. What's vitally important to design something like the Great Pyramid, which incorporates its latitude and also the circumference of the Earth and the precession of the equinoxes, plus the seasons and the 12 signs of the zodiac, all in one phenomenal conurbation. This is not just as Khufu's pyramid, but as the complete group of the Giza necropolis, if you like,
Yeah.
was that it needed an instrument that could measure not just vertical angles, but horizontal angles. And that's the difficulty, and there was no instrument that could do that. And archaeology at the time, you must remember this is a long time ago now, it's 10 years, and there are people who are professors now in archaeology that were still at school when I made this discovery. Was that there was no instrument that would measure. And what kind of instrument would we be looking for? Well, we would be looking for an instrument that acted as a modern theodolite. Every housing estate that's ever built, everything that's ever constructed, the levels and the falls and the design and everything, you see guys out, they've got white or yellow hats on, and they've got theodolites, and theodolites are for finding measurements and angles and so forth. And even when we create motorways and roads, highways if you like, the surveyor always aligns them to the pole stars. They need to find true north so they can get their alignments right and so forth. So I'm looking for an instrument that can do that. I'm looking for an instrument that can act as a theodolite. And I can't find one. I was experimenting in my back garden. I thought, well, I know they've got pieces of wood, so let's muck about with a piece of wood. And what you should know, as well as having an understanding of surveying and construction and architecture, I'm also a sailor. So I have an understanding of navigation, and navigation for sailor also comes from understanding the stars. And in modern navigation and in modern astronomy, we still use zodiac signs. So that's really important. We divide the sky up into 360 degrees, all lined out beautifully on a grid, and we recognize the parts of the sky we're looking at by the constellations. Okay, so I'm looking at that, and I'm looking at astronomy, and I'm looking at my navigation experience, and I'm looking at my construction experience and my design experience, and I'm saying, how can I do it? So let's get a piece of wood. Let's start there. So take a piece of wood and stick it up to the pole star, okay, and sight along it. Fine, that's cool. Well, that works, but not very well. It doesn't work very well because my hand isn't as steady as it ought to be, and so it shakes around this tiny dot in the sky. I need a support, so I need a fulcrum. A fulcrum, like a crossbar. I'm trying to make a T-piece now. So I make a T-piece, okay, and I balance the crossbar on a stick, and then I can get back and I can sort of sit down on my hunkers, or I can kneel down and I can sight up at the sky, and it's steady. Fine. That's great. What else did the Egyptians have that will help me? Well, I need to be able to make a scale, and I need to be able to make, I know the Egyptians used 360 degrees. They're great at architecture. We know that they were great at geometry. We know that. So let's have a look at that. Okay, we know they have wheels, and there's expressions of wheels with it, so we don't have any difficulty with that. And we know something else that's very important. There was a law in Egypt, and that was particularly used in the weighing of the heart ceremony, which made it a law, was a plumb line. When they do the weighing and the heart ceremony, they made scales, and the scales were weighing the heart against, in the canopic jar of the pharaoh, against the feather of truth, known as the feather of Maat. And if the heart was heavier than the feather of truth, honesty, justice, and so forth, then what happened is the pharaoh would be regenerated, and he wouldn't go to heaven, he wouldn't become a star. And this was the judgment that was placed on him for the way in which he looked after his people and ran his life. Well, they used a plumb line on the scales. They used it because it was a law, and they had to make sure that it was absolutely bang on, otherwise it would send the pharaoh in the wrong direction. If you get my meaning.
Yes.
And so we know that plumb lines were important. We know that the Egyptians used them to a great degree, and so let's just use a plumb line. So what's the basic thing we need? Well, we need a wheel, and we need to stick it on an upright, and we need a crossbar to sight along. But we also need something else. We need to be able to look at it in a horizontal direction as well as a vertical direction. And so we put a wheel on, and this is exactly what I did. I put a wheel on, and I marked it out at 360 degrees using a simple protractor, extending the lines out so I could get it. And I got into my back garden, and I sighted the pole star, and I checked it against the GPS, and it was like within 20 miles.
Did you realise at that time that it looked like
No, that
Celtic
was the
cross?
whole point. I was standing there doing this and found myself kneeling in front of the cross and sighting the pole star, and it suddenly just hit. I thought, what is this? I've got a Celtic cross in my hand, and I've seen these all my life. You know?
You weren't onto the Celtic cross at that
Wasn't
time?
onto the Celtic cross at all at the time.
Right.
And what happened was I found that this was the only way in which I, using primitive thought, could basically measure an angle in the way that I wanted to. So I found that. Surprised, went off, researched it, did everything I could to research it on the internet. And
Does this relate to the Dixon relics?
Well, yes, it does, and I'll tell you why. What happened was that I got distracted then, because I got, this is a Celtic cross, surely this is obvious, but I've never heard of it. Remember, I've been in surveying and navigation, I've done some astronomy, and so I've never heard of a cross and a wheel on it as being an instrument for measurement with a plumb line. And I went off and researched it, and then came up with all the things throughout the world of Celtic crosses and wheel crosses and the connection with Scandinavia, Ireland, and the Vikings, all of this sort of business. And then eventually, after a period of about a year and a half of research, went back to the Great Pyramid, which is what I'd started me investigating in the first place. And that's how I came about to see the Dixon relics for what they were. Because prior to seeing the Dixon relics for what they were, if I hadn't have discovered the wheel cross, I wouldn't have recognised them. Okay, so what I found was that a more accurate way of, rather than a gigantic wheel cross, of dividing down each degree into arc minutes, okay, was to make what's known as an exponential scale. Now, an exponential scale is very simple. It's like the rays of the sun, or any angle that goes from the centre of zero outward.
Like the rays of the sun seen on the Akhenaten.
Absolutely,
images of the sun.
exactly right. And so that, in fact, in that case, you can also say that Akhenaten was quite well aware
Yes.
of this. Which is very similar to the rays of the sun from pictures of Akhenaten, showing life coming from the sun. The exponential scale is really a quarter of a circle, and it makes it much more accurate to do so, to make it like this, so that 1 degree comes broken down into 10 parts, similar to the decans stars used by the Egyptians for measuring 36 decans times 10 is 360 degrees. And breaking it down, it breaks it down into arc minutes. It makes it a much smaller item to use for measuring with the plumb line. So if you can see that mounted on a cross staff up and down, the plumb line hung from the top here, and what happens is the line, as it's tilted, measures off the angle along the degrees and arc minutes. And this is actually accurate to 3 arc miles at the equator of the Earth, which is very, very accurate indeed. It's 3 nautical miles, or 3 arc minutes, is a distance to the horizon, the place of time, the zone of Horus, if you like. And so I looked for an exponential scale, and the reason I wanted an exponential scale is that you reduce the size of the instrument. It's almost like a vernier. It reduces the size of the instrument from a wheel. So you have a very simple scale rule, and of course it sprang to mind at the time, you know, things like yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, your rod and your staff will comfort me, means something now.